Hi guys, so today we're going to continue using up all my yummy strawberries that I picked from Lewis Farms. If you haven't watched the video on how to clean and cut the strawberries, go do that first. That way you'll be ready to roll right into our next recipe. So I'm going to be cutting up the rest of my strawberries because the next two recipes that I'm going to make I might be doubling or halving depending on how many strawberries I have. So the way that you do that is if you are going to double a recipe, which if I have enough, I will be doubling the strawberry crumb bar recipe. And so what I will do is for every ingredient, I will just do it twice. So that way I'm making twice as much and therefore doubling the amount that I would normally get. If I don't have enough strawberries to do that, and for some reason I don't have enough to even make 2 full batches of both recipes, then what I'm going to do is half a recipe, and just like doubling, I'm going to take all my ingredients, but instead of timesing it by 2, I'm going to divide each ingredient by 2. So a little bit of math involved, but we'll give it a go. So I have a couple of strawberries that I already cleaned and cut the tops off. I'm going to go ahead and clean and cut the tops off of these, and I'm going to start cutting them up. So give me a second, get all these cleaned and the caps cut off, and then we'll be ready to start. Alright, so I'm going to get ready to cut my strawberries. When I am doing that, make sure you have your cutting board so you're not cutting on the countertop directly. And then you want to make sure that you have a paring knife. A paring knife is a little bit different than your typical knife that you would use when you're eating dinner, or like a steak knife, because the edge of a paring knife is completely smooth. There's no jagged edges like you would see if you were using a table knife, or even a bread knife is serrated, that all those little points. We don't want to use those because it's going to jag up our fruit, and we want to keep our fruit as whole as possible, because if we start mushing it, then that's less yummy fruitness that's going into our recipe. So I'm going to get my camera set up and we'll be cutting. So for this recipe, to make the crumb bars, I need 2 cups of strawberries chopped. So I have my measuring cup here, so as I chop, I can go ahead and add my strawberries to that measuring cup, so it'll be ready to go. Unlike the shortbread or the scone recipe I did earlier, I'm not going to cut them as small. So instead I'm going to tilt my strawberry upright. So I cut the tops off, and I'm going to let it stand like this, and I'm going to cut a window cut. So I'm going to cut vertically down and then horizontally. I like to keep cutting one direction instead of constantly changing my knife. So I'm going to cut vertically, which I've already done, hold my strawberries together, and then just turn them. So now I'm still cutting vertically. Now I have my 4 pieces. I'm going to keep 2 of them together and just put them down flat. So as you can see, my pieces are much bigger than they were yesterday, but still small enough that I can get a good strawberry bite with each one. So I'm going to continue doing that. Again, my caps cut off, put it down, vertical, turn my strawberry, vertical. So I've made 4 equal pieces. I'm going to pull them apart, push them flat down again, and cut in half. Remember, when you're cutting, you don't want to put your finger up here. You want to keep those fingers wrapped around. Your other hand is kind of gripping a little bit like this, pulling your fingernails in. That way you're holding the strawberry so it's not moving around, but your fingers are not in the way of the knife. The reason why I just keep those pieces together when I push them flat is it's just less cuts that I have to make. If you wanted to do them one by one, you definitely could. If you wanted to do one cut and then the other one, that would be fine. I'm just trying to save a little bit of time, a little less cutting by keeping my slices together. So I'm about a cup right now, which is a good sign. It tells me I might have enough to make double this recipe. We'll see. Whoops, I didn't cut those even smaller. Alright, so I'm going to keep chopping up the rest of my strawberries. Obviously, if you're just making this recipe, you want to just cut up till you have 2 cups of chopped strawberries. So, good news, I have enough strawberries that I am going to double this recipe, and then for my next recipe, I'm actually going to halve it, which is okay because it's pretty much just going to be me eating it, so I can't eat as much as I would love to say I could eat all the strawberry things. I really can't. So we're going to double the crumb recipe, and I will tell you, it is actually my very good friend Justin's birthday, and he lives down the street. He lives like a block from my house, and so I'm going to make double the batch for him and his family, and that'll be that. So I'm very excited to get to use all my fresh strawberries that I picked from Lewis Farm to make yummy treats for me, but also make some yummy treats for my friends, especially in this time when we can't necessarily hang out for fun things like birthdays, but we make it work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to preheat the oven to 375. And then while that is getting ready, I'm going to get my pan ready. Just like my scones, I'm going to be using parchment paper. Whoa. And just like I told you with the scones that you have to use parchment paper, not wax paper. You know, it looks very similar and it kind of has a very similar texture, but wax paper burns. I found that out the hard way. Parchment paper, however, does not. So you want to use parchment paper just so that your paper does not catch on fire in the oven, because that would be very problematic. Now, paper is really just sitting on top of this right now, and honestly, I'm okay with that because I know once I put my batter in, it'll allow it to sink. It's not going to sit on top of my container. So I'm just going to move my parchment paper in my pan. One quick note, because I did double this recipe, I had to use a different pan. So normally I would use an 8x8 square pan, which are those like silver pans that you might have that are a square size. A 9x9 would work too. But because I'm doing double of this recipe, I'm going to use a 9x13 pan, which is like your typical casserole dish, just because I'm going to have more, and crumb bars don't necessarily go high, they kind of spread out. So it would be silly for me to try and put it in the same 8x8 pan, because then I would have base, jelly, and then crumb, because I have all this extra topping. So 9x13 if you're doubling, 8x8 or 9x9 if you are not. Alright, and just like in our last go, we are going to be mixing our dry ingredients first, and then adding in our wet ingredients, and we'll also be cutting in the butter. So this is a really common tool, or common technique I should say, in baking when you want something that's crispy and fluffy and flaky. Think like a biscuit. Does a lot of cutting in, and just like I told you last time, we're not going to be cutting our batter with a knife or with scissors. That's silly. Instead, what you could use is a pastry cutter, which I don't have said fancy tool. I will be using a fork. Actually, I will probably be using my hands, because I found out last time with my scones that the fork was helpful to an extent, but not the most easy of tools to use. And then when I was looking up this recipe, I actually found a shortcut, which is to use your food processor. So if you have a food processor, you can actually make this in there. Just give it a couple pulses, and it should make that crumbly texture that you're looking for. I'm not going to do that because I don't like to clean things. And I'm going to be using my food processor for my jam when I'm done with this recipe. So I'm going to make it in my mixer, just because I'm lazy and I don't want to clean out my food processor 2 times. Okay, so I'm going to get my materials set up, get my dry ingredients, and we'll be ready to go. Alright, so we're going to start off with the sugar. Now, the recipe that I'm following calls for 1/2 cup of white sugar. However, remember I'm doubling, so every ingredient I have to do 2 times. Well, 1/2, 2 times is 2 halves. Conveniently, I've been teaching a lot of fractions, and I know that 2 halves is equal to or equivalent to 1 whole. So 1 whole cup of sugar. If you watched my scone recipe, you noticed that I found my 1 cup, which was really exciting because yesterday when I was making scones, I did not have 1 cup and I had to do it all in fourths. So that was sad. And I'm just going to scoop out a cup of sugar. Try and get it even. There we go. All right. Next, I need, it says for a 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder. Again, I am doubling, so I really need 2 halves of a teaspoon, aka 1 whole teaspoon. Like I said in my scone video, the baking powder, not baking soda, be very, very careful. This is a leveling agent, so it allows things to rise, which is helpful. Because we want our crumb bars to be nice and fluffy and not just one little thin layer. We want it to activate all these other ingredients and get them nice and fluffy as well. So we will be doing a 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder. So I'm going to scoop my teaspoon in there, and then I'm going to use this, I don't really know what it is, level to help. I'm going to scrape my teaspoon across it, and it's going to make a nice flat, even teaspoon. Alright, next up is a 1/4 a teaspoon of salt. So I'm going to get my salt. Remember, with salt, I am not going to measure it over my bowl because I don't want, in case I drop some or I have an overflow, I don't want all of that going in my bowl. That would be bad. We don't want too much salt. Salt helps round out the flavors. Obviously, strawberry crumb bars are not going to be a salty snack. However, you need salt to bring out some of the other flavors. I told you in the scone recipe, you have salt taste buds and you have sweet taste buds and you have sour taste buds, and by adding some of these different tasting elements, even though your treat is mostly sweet, it helps you taste all that sweetness just a little bit more. Alright, next I need the 1 1/2 cups of all-purpose flour. Alright, so I'm just going to do that twice, and I need a knife. Remember, when you're scooping out flour, it's really important that you get it really level, and we don't have this heaping lump of flour. We want to make sure that it's all the right amount of flour to make sure that our recipe comes out the way we want it to. And the way we do that is we just get a heaping scoop, and I use the back edge, not the side I would normally use, and I just give it a couple of taps. Make sure it's all filled into any holes, and then I'm going to take it this way horizontally and run it across the top. That'll help me get a nice flat scoop. So there's 1 cup, and I had a 1/2 cup. I found all my measuring cups after I couldn't find any of them yesterday. I'm going to do the same thing. And I'm going to do that again because, again, I am doubling my recipe, which means I have to double all my ingredients. I don't know if I said to double the salt, but I did double the salt. I did it said a 1/4 of a teaspoon, so I did 2/4 of a teaspoon, which I know is equal to 1/2. So I did a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Alright, so now I have all my dry ingredients together. And I'm a little floury. So I am going to get my cutting board back out and my paring knife because I am going to cut some butter that I'm going to then be cutting into my dry ingredients to make that flaky, buttery, crispy, crunchy topping and bottom that I want on these crumb bars. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I have my stick of butter here, and it calls for 1/2 cup of butter. So typically that's going to be 1 stick if you're used to those like long skinny rectangles. I have different butter here, and so I had to count out 8 tablespoons because 8 tablespoons is equal to 1/2 cup of butter. Because this foil is a little thicker than the material I was using yesterday, I don't know if I'm going to keep it on the paper, but what I like to do when I'm cutting butter, especially cold butter, and it's really important that it's cold because we want the butter to then melt when it's in the oven. If it is melting when it's in the oven, it's going to let everything get crispy and crunchy and crumbly while it's baking, instead of getting like really soupy when it's just batter. I don't want soupy batter because then I won't have the crumbly topping that I'm after. So very important to use cold butter. And my trick is I unwrap it except on one side because I want that side to help hold my butter in place. So we'll see how this goes. I'm just going to cut it into small-ish chunks. Size doesn't super matter. I mean, obviously I want to try and make them as even as I can. Well, this butter is cutting much better than the butter I used for my skins. Whoa, stay on there. Very nice. Right, and I'm just going to turn it this way and do one last cut just to make these pieces a little bit smaller. Alright, I'm going to start crumbling in all my butter chunks that I just cut. If I can even get them apart, now they're stuck together. Cutting up all my butter chunks. I'm just adding them straight to my dry ingredients. My flour, my baking soda, my sugar. I gave this dry mixture a quick stir a second ago, so all my dry ingredients are all mixed together. And what I did last time is I used a fork. Let me grab a fork real quick. I know, we're excited. We're all excited for these pastry. So I just used my fork to push through, and I'm wanting the butter and the dry ingredients to come through those tines. If you have a pastry cutter, this is a little easier. I will try and use my fork as best I can with loud dogs. But I will tell you, I'll ultimately just start putting my hands in there and squishing it up because it's a little easier for me to do it that way. So what I just did is I forgot that I was doubling this recipe, even though I had talked about it for the last 15 minutes. So I cut up the other half of my butter. I added another 8 tablespoons to a total of a cup of butter. And I'm just using my hands to really just squish together the dry ingredients with the butter. It is not easy, but it is kind of fun. And it's really hard to overmix this with your hands. Now, if you were using food processor, this would probably take 15 seconds. And I'm really regretting doing an arm workout this morning because this is definitely an arm workout. But it's fun and you get to squish your fingers in there. So if you don't have a food processor, or if you want to just be a little messy and dirty like I am right now, just get in there and start squishing it together. I'm looking for my dough to be crumbly. That's kind of a weird texture that I'm looking for, but it should still be really loose. But the pieces should be sticking together more so than when it was just flour in there. You'll kind of start to see it start to crumble into bigger size crumbs as you keep mixing this. You want to make sure all your butter, see, I just found a butter ball, and I'm going to smush that in with some other flour. really get that nice and crumbly. So you want to make sure you don't have any butter balls. Crumble them all up nice and good. Alright, I'm going to keep working this, and then we'll move on to our wet ingredients. Alright, so you can kind of start to see some of those big crumbles in there. That's really what I'm looking for. Like I said, if you used a food processor, this probably took you all of 20 seconds to get here. However, I got a nice second arm workout mixing this in there, and I hope you guys had fun doing it. I also learned from my scone recipe to cut my fingernails. It still left me quite a bit of butter and sugar and flour mixture underneath there, but definitely not as bad as yesterday. So now we're going to get started with our wet ingredients, our liquid ingredients. And so I got another small bowl, and I'm going to crack my recipe calls for 1 egg, but that means I'm going to be doing 2 eggs into my bowl. I always start with whatever my wet ingredients are. I always start with my eggs first, because sometimes when I'm cracking an egg, I get a shell in there, and it's a lot easier for me to pick out that shell that might have accidentally fallen in there when it's just eggs than if I have all these other ingredients. It gets a little yucky. So I'm going to crack my eggs into my bowl, and we'll get ready to go. Alright, so I have my 2 eggs in my bowl, and the next is vanilla. Now, typically I don't measure vanilla, which I know is a super bad habit. However, I just love vanilla that I typically just go to town and dump it in, because it's just a small amount that normal recipes are calling for. However, this recipe calls for a teaspoon of vanilla, which actually means for me 2 teaspoons of vanilla, so I'm going to measure this one out. Again, I can do the vanilla over the bowl because I am not sad if I get a little extra. In fact, I'm even going to put just a tiny bit more because that's how much I love vanilla. Alright, so I'm going to whisk my wet ingredients together. You can do this with a fork, however, a fork is just going to be a little harsher to our eggs. So I have my little baby whisk today, and I'm just going to whisk, aka stir, these 2 ingredients together, making sure I break the yolks and it all comes together. I have my baby whisk almost fell in. I have my liquids and I have my dry ingredients ready to go, so I'm going to get them up on a mixer ready to get mixed together. So I have my dry ingredients here, and I am going to turn this on stir. It is ridiculously slow, and it's going to allow my wet ingredients to come in really nicely without overdoing my crumbles. So go ahead and turn that stir on. And I'm very slowly adding in my wet ingredients. I'm even stopping as I'm pouring just a little bit in to give it some time to really come together and make a nice crumbly dough. Starting to come together. The mixer's having to work a little bit to get it to mix, and I think that is good. Alright, so now I need to get my strawberries ready to go. So I'm going to get another bowl that I'm going to put them in, and then I'm going to be putting in a little bit of sugar and a little bit of cornstarch to help thicken those up for that middle layer. Alright, so now what I'm going to be doing is I've got my strawberries that I cut up. Remember, I have doubled the recipe, so I have quite a few more strawberries than you, and that's okay. And now I'm going to make that creamy strawberry jelly type jam that's going to go in the middle of our crumb bars. And so to do that is I'm going to add about a 1/3 cup of sugar, and because I'm doubling this recipe, I'm I'm gonna add 2/3 cups of sugar. Sprinkle that right over top of my strawberries. And then I'm going to add cornstarch. If you've never worked with cornstarch, cornstarch is a thickener. It's typically used in like gravies to thicken them up, or soups even to thicken them up. Typically you don't add cornstarch directly to your recipe. You can in baking because it's usually got other things going on, but if you were trying to thicken up gravy, you wouldn't just dump cornstarch in there. You have to kind of mix it in slowly, otherwise you'll just taste a big clump of cornstarch, and that would be not yummy. Alright, so I need, let me just double check my recipe, 2 teaspoons of cornstarch, which means, because I'm doubling, it's going to be 4 teaspoons of cornstarch. I'm going to use the same technique I've been using, which is to use the sides to make my nice flat, even cornstarch. Come on. Scoop, and I'm going to do this 4 times. Alright, and I'm going to get a spoon, and I'm just going to give this a nice quick stir, and you'll see the sugar and the cornstarch really starting to stick to those strawberries, which is exactly what I want to happen. Give them a nice coat. They should almost look like Sour Patch Kids. You know how they have the sugar salt mixture on the outside? That's what these will kind of look like, and that's a good thing. Whenever you make something that has fruit in it, like this, and it's in a pastry, a lot of times, I don't want to say all times, but a lot of times you want to coat it with something, because if you've ever made, and blueberries are my favorite fruit, so I do a lot of cooking with blueberries, and I used to make blueberry muffins, but what would happen is I would add my blueberries, and then when I baked my muffins, all the blueberries would sink to the bottom. And I would be so sad, because that would be the best part. Now it's stuck at the bottom instead of sitting all through my muffin. So you want to make sure that you give the fruit a coating, and what that does is when it is baking, the coating that you have holds on to the batter so it doesn't sink to the bottom, and they're able to be in the different layers that you want them to be in. Alright, I think that's good and mixed, so I'm going to get my dish back over here, and we're going to start assembling our layers. So I have my pan with my parchment paper, and again my parchment paper is still kind of sitting on top because I haven't put anything in it to weigh it down. And I'm going to take about half of the dough that I prepared in my bowl to make my bottom layer crust. So I'm just going to use my hands to get it in there, get my parchment paper to work. And I'm just going to use my fingers to really spread it out. When I made the scones, I made a really thick layer because I wanted my scones to be really thick and fluffy. For this bottom crust recipe, I'm going to be making a really thin layer. So as you're smushing it in to the bottom of your pan, keep in mind that you want a nice thin bottom layer. This crumb bar is not going to rise so much, like if you think of like a cookie or a cake. So we want to be really purposeful with our layer sizes so that it is what we want it to. Alright, I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to finish making my bottom layer, and we'll keep assembling our dish. Alright, so I gave my hands a quick wash, kind of get all my crumbs off, but you can see I made the bottom layer by really smushing it in with my fingers. I even kind of went up the edges just a little bit, kind of help hold in that yummy strawberry filling that I'm about to put on top of this. So I'm going to use my spoon, and I'm just going to add in all my strawberries. I'm gonna also use my spoon to help push my strawberries around so they're all in the nooks and crannies, because I want every bite to be filled with strawberry yumminess. You might notice that your cornstarch was starting to work. I know I am, because some of the juices of the strawberries were left over in the bowl once I got them out, and my juices started to get a little thick. So I'm just spreading out my strawberries, trying to cover as much of my bottom layer as I can. I don't want to leave holes. I don't really want my strawberries doubling up too much. I want a nice flat layer of strawberry yumminess. Push some of these guys over here. Alright, so there's my middle layer of strawberry deliciousness. Just waiting for me to do the final layer, which is whatever dough you have left over, which I have a little less than half. I'm going to crumble it and just kind of drizzle it over top. So some of these pieces will be nice and big, some of them will be a little bit smaller, but I'm just going to drop some of my dough into crumbly pieces on top. Now, I will try to fill in as much as I can with my dough, but I will tell you that if there are some places where the strawberries are really peeking out, that's okay. It's going to be just fine. So I'm going to keep covering my crumb bars with my crumb topping, and when I'm all done, I'll come back and we will get this in the oven. Alright, so I've got my crumb topping all on top of my crumb bars. As you can still see some of the strawberries peeking out, and that's okay. And I've included a lot of really big crumb pieces because we all know the crumb topping is really the best part. I'm going to go ahead and put these in the oven. My time says 40 to 45 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and put them in for 40. Remember, when you're baking, you always want to go with the first time increment. Because you can't unbake something. So if your oven runs a little hotter, you'll be able to pull them out on time instead of just going with the middle or going with the later time. We can always leave our crumb bars in for a little bit longer if they need to, but I'm going to start mine at 40. Alright, so I just popped my crumb bars in the oven, and so while I'm waiting, because this is a really long time to wait for something delicious, I am going to clean up my space and get myself ready because I have another recipe that I'm going to share with you as well. Alright guys, so I just pulled my crumb bars out of the oven. I let them go for the full 40 minutes, but I'm really happy with how they turned out, so I'm going to turn off my oven and be done. But I wanted to show you what it should start to look like. So you'll notice that those crumbles have now started to get nice and crispy. My strawberry looks so yum. This is really hot. I'm gonna go put it back down to cool. I know you think you want some. But yeah, I hope you make these. If you do, please be sure to let them cool all the way. In fact, I'm gonna let them cool down, and then I'm even gonna pop them in the fridge for a little bit just to make them really set up before I take them over to my friend's house. But that is all for Cooking Club. I got one more recipe that we're gonna do that is super easy and super quick. So, bye guys.